Act 1, Cold Open. A park bench, late afternoon, autumn of 1967, Washington, D.C. Two men in heavy wool overcoats are talking quietly in Russian, just down the street from the Soviet embassy. A few feet away, in the grass, a gray and white cat sits very politely, tail curled, eyes half closed, the picture of an animal that is not in a hurry to be anywhere. Inside that cat, there is a microphone, a transmitter, an antenna running under her skin from the base of her skull all the way down her spine into her tail. She is the most expensive cat in the history of espionage, and nobody, before today, has told her that. Act 2, the setup. To understand how a cat ended up on that bench, you have to understand the era she was working in. The Cold War was a lot of things. It was missiles in Cuba, it was tanks at the Fulda Gap, it was kitchen table panic about fallout shelters in Iowa, but mostly, day to day, it was a listening war. Both sides bugged each other's offices. They bugged hotel rooms in Moscow and Vienna. They bugged ashtrays. At one point, the Soviets handed the American ambassador a beautifully carved wooden seal as a gift, and that seal sat on his wall for 7 years before anyone realized it had a tiny passive resonator inside it. Both sides, in other words, had reasons to be paranoid, and both sides were. Out of all that paranoia, in the early 1960s, came a small office in Langley, Virginia, called the Office of Technical Service. They worked under the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. Their job, in the simplest terms, was to dream up the tools. Some of those tools were brilliant, some of them were ordinary, and some of them, to put it gently, were ideas you would not have approved on a Tuesday morning if you had slept properly the night before. By around 1961, somebody on that team had landed on an old, persistent question. If you cannot get a microphone into the room, can you get it past the room, past the guards, past the sweeps, past the fence, past, in fact, the entire concept of human surveillance? The answer they reached for was simple, in the way that only very dangerous answers are simple. A cat. Act 3, how it unfolded. The thinking was almost reasonable if you squinted. Cats wander, cats do not look like spies, cats can sit at the foot of a bench in a Washington park for 40 minutes and nobody is going to file a report about it. A briefcase that walks too close to the embassy will get noticed. A tabby that walks too close will get a quiet shoe. So the engineers built a plan. Take a domestic cat, implant a small microphone in the ear canal, place a tiny transmitter at the base of the skull, run a fine antenna under the skin, along the spine, all the way into the tail. Bring her around, send her in, listen to whatever she happens to be sitting next to. The surgery, by the standards of 1960s veterinary medicine, was not trivial. It took roughly an hour. It required a real surgeon, real anesthesia, and a real engineer in the room making sure the audio path closed when the cat woke up. Then came the training. Cats, as anyone who has ever owned one will tell you, are not famous for their respect for a chain of command. Trainers worked for months. Click, treat, walk to the voices, sit, stay. Do not, under any circumstances, get distracted by a pigeon, a sandwich wrapper, or your own tail.
The records say the cats could be trained to move short distances on cue. That is a careful sentence. Read it again. Short distances. On cue. It is also, you may notice, the kind of sentence a man writes when his project is about to get canceled. By the mid-1960s, the program had a name. It always does. Operation Acoustic Kitty. And it had a budget. According to figures declassified around 2001, that budget came in at roughly $20 million across about 6 years. 20 million 1960s dollars. To put it kindly, that is a lot of money. To put it less kindly, that is a small infantry battalion's annual cost. To put it more kindly than the project deserves, it is not, by Pentagon standards, even a top-shelf scandal. But it is a great deal of money to spend on, in the end, one cat. In the early days, the budget bought optimism. By 1967, the budget bought a field test. Act 4. The punchline. The technicians decided their first cat was as ready as a cat was ever going to be. They drove her in a small carrier to a park in Washington, D.C., a quiet stretch of benches near the Soviet embassy. The target was simple. 2 Soviet officials on a bench. Walk toward them, sit, listen, transmit. Now, here is where the story splits in two. The version most people have heard comes from a former CIA officer named Victor Marchetti, who described the program publicly in the 1970s. In his telling, the cat stepped off the curb, into the avenue, and a passing taxi clipped her before she ever reached the bench. End of cat, end of mission, end of $20 million, on a sunny afternoon, on a single fender. It is a clean story. It has a punchline. It has a yellow taxi in it. You can practically hear the slide whistle. Then, in 2009, a man named Robert Wallace published a book called Spycraft. Wallace had run the very office that built the cat, and in his account, no taxi was ever involved. He said the cat was recovered after the test. The hardware was removed. The cat was returned to a normal life as presumably a perfectly ordinary cat with very strong opinions about being picked up. We do not, today, get to know which version is exactly true. The honest answer is somewhere in those two memories. What we do have is the document everyone agrees on, a 1967 internal CIA memo declassified in 2001 under the Freedom of Information Act. The memo says in plain language that the cats could indeed be trained to move short distances, but that environmental and security factors did not lend themselves to practical use, so the program was closed. It is the politest funeral notice ever written for a cat. Act 5. What became of it? After 1967, Operation Acoustic Kitty went quietly into a filing cabinet. The Office of Technical Service moved on to other tools. The Directorate of Science and Technology moved on to other animals, other gadgets, other Tuesday morning ideas. Marchetti left the agency. He wrote critical books. He told the taxi story until the taxi story became the only story most people remembered. Wallace stayed inside the building for decades, ran the same office, and wrote his own quieter account much later. Neither man, in the end, had reason to lie. They simply remembered different rooms.
The memo sat in an archive for 34 years. When it finally came out in 2001, the public reaction was almost exactly the reaction you would expect. A short laugh, a long shake of the head, and then a quieter question. How many other $20 million memos are still in that archive? Acoustic Kitty was not alone. It belonged to a whole family of Cold War animal experiments. Years before, B.F. Skinner had pitched the U.S. military on Project Pigeon, a guidance system in which pigeons would peck at a target image inside a bomb's nose cone. The Navy spent decades training dolphins. The KGB and Soviet military had their own animal programs, some of them never fully declassified. For about a generation, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, serious people in serious offices believed that an animal could go where a man could not. And the strange part is, they were not entirely wrong. They were just early. Today, that same instinct lives inside drones the size of hummingbirds, listening devices smaller than a coin, and software that does not need to walk through any park at all. The cat, in some sense, won. The cat just had to wait. Act 6. Hank's Close. I keep coming back, when I think about this one, to that single gray and white cat in the carrier. Not the budget, not the memo, the cat. Somewhere in there is the lesson that engineering excellence and good judgment are two different muscles, and you can build an extremely impressive thing without ever stopping to ask whether the world wanted it built. The cat did not file the proposal. The cat did not approve the budget. The cat just did her job, as cats understand jobs, which is to say, mostly on her own terms. If forgotten corners of American history are your kind of story, the next one is already in the saddle. I will see you down the trail.